I was studying with Milton Erickson, 1977, and he told me this story. It was a woman who was the aunt of one of his former patients, Erickson's former patients. And this guy called up Erickson and he said, "Dr. Erickson, I know you're going to Milwaukee to give a lecture. My aunt, I'm very close with my aunt. We talk about once a week on the telephone." They both lived in Arizona, Erickson and this patient. And he said, "You're going to go give a lecture in Milwaukee. I wonder if you could help sort out my aunt. She's become depressed. She's had a physical illness in the last few years. She's been confined to a wheelchair. And she has inherited a lot of money from the family, and she lives in this big house all alone. And she's just withdrawn from the world. Hard for her to get around. In this 1950s, the world wasn't very wheelchair accessible. So Erickson went, gave his lecture, stopped by the woman's house. She had heard about the great Milton Erickson who helped her nephew so much, and there was this amazing, strange guy. So he gets to her door, and he knocks on the door, and she opens the door in the wheelchair. Well, Erickson walks with canes. And in the 1950s, anybody who is disabled sort of has an instant bond with one another because they're different. In the 1950s, everybody was supposed to be the same. So anybody who is different knows society treats you a little strangely when you have any sort of disability. Still does, but less so, hopefully. And so Erickson walks with these canes. She invites him in. And as we Americans do, I'm sorry, I've been here, I know you don't do this, we say, "Would you like to see the house?" This is a strange American thing, but we do this. I know people don't do it here. And when I've had friends come from Britain, I say, "Would you like to see the house?" And then later they say, "Why did you do that?" You know, and it's just what we do. It's just our cultural thing. So she says, "Would you like to see the house?" Well, her house is quite extraordinary. It's 11 rooms. She lives there all alone. And she's gotten it revamped for having wheelchairs. She has ramps. She even has an elevator that takes her the 3 stories of the house. And so she shows him this. And although that's pretty impressive, what's even more impressive to Erickson is that this looks like a depressing house. She's so embarrassed about being in a wheelchair, she keeps the curtains drawn. So everything's kind of dark in there. And the furniture, which was probably new in 1900, now it's 1950s, looks faded and shabby, and it smells a little mildewy. It just seems like a lonely, worn-out house. And finally she gets to the end of this when she's telling him about her life. She said, "Well, I used to have a very active life. I was active in the community. I was active in my church. I'm a Christian. And I was very active in my church, but it's very hard to get there now. I have this fellow who will drive me, and he puts the wheelchair in the back of the car. He drives me to church, but it's kind of a bother. So I don't do it very much." Finally, they get to the end of the tour, and she shows him what she's been saving the best for last, which is a greenhouse, a plant nursery that's attached to the house. She spends most of her days there puttering around growing plants, and she has kind of a green thumb. Erickson grew up on a farm. He's very interested in plants and growing things. And he looks all around, and he sees these plants that are sitting on the shelf, which have these little cuttings, very small cuttings. And he asks about them, and she says, "They all came from this one plant, this African violet plant." He says, "It's very difficult to get cuttings to grow." And she said, "Yes, it's very difficult, but I have this talent." So he looks at her and he says, "Your nephew is worried about you." She said, "Yes, I know." "He thinks you're depressed." "Yes, I have been rather depressed in the last few years." Erickson says, "I don't think that's what the problem is." She said, "You don't?" He says, "No, I think the problem is you haven't been a very good Christian." She's a little offended by this because she's grown up in this very judgmental, moralistic family. And he says, well, he explains himself, and she relaxes a little. He says, "No, you have all this time on your hands. You have this amazing talent with plants. What I recommend is you get your church newsletter and the membership list from your church. And any time in the church newsletter you see an announcement of a birth, a death, a graduation, an engagement, a marriage, an illness, any happy or sad event in somebody in the congregation's life, that you get this fellow who drives you, you get one of these African violet plants, and you repot it into a gift pot. and bring it over with your congratulations or condolences or whatever's appropriate for the circumstance. So she agrees. Maybe she's been too wrapped up in herself since she's been ill, and that she hasn't really done her community duty or her Christian duty, and she agrees to do this. Now, that's in the 1950s. I'm sitting in Erickson's office in the 1970s, 1977, with 2 other students that day. And he sends me to his bookshelf to get out one of his scrapbooks. And I get out the scrapbook, and he directs me to a certain page. And I open this page, and the other 2 students and I read this article from the Milwaukee paper. And it's headlined, "African Violet Queen of Milwaukee Dies, Mourned by Thousands." They can't fit the people in the church that want to come to a memorial service when she's died 11 years later, because she's touched so many people's lives. She's always been the one who's shown up when you need something, when there's a happy or sad event. And so, close the scrapbook, I put it back up on the shelf. The other students leave. I didn't have any money to pay Erickson for his teaching, so he had me do gardening for him. So we go out to the garden. He's in a wheelchair by now. And I wheel him out to the garden, and he's out there. And I was very shy at the time, and Erickson was a very intimidating figure. But I worked up my courage, and I looked at him, and I said, "Dr. Erickson, I was very moved by that African Violet Queen story. That was very moving to me. And I just have to ask you, how do I learn to work that way? Because I'm in graduate school now, and they're telling me if somebody's depressed, I should send them to the psychiatrist for medications. Or I should find out about their family of origin and how depression has come down through their family of origin. Or I should help them change their irrational thinking that's part and parcel of their depression. How do I find the way to work like the African Violet Queen, like you talked about?" He looked down at the ground for a little while, and he said, "I looked all around at her life. Everything looked depressing. The only sign of life I could see was those African violets. And I decided it would be easier to grow the African violet parts of her life than to weed out the depression." And for me, that was like a billiard ball hitting me. It shot me in a different direction as a psychotherapist, this direction I've been telling you about this morning. That is, I'm searching anytime I can, if there's a possibility, to discover the African violet parts of people's lives. That is, what's working, where their energy is, where the health is, where they have resources and abilities and competence, because they've come in talking about a place where they're not feeling very competent, where they're not feeling very healthy, where they're stuck, where they're suffering in some ways. And so, like a heat-seeking missile, I'm really searching for that. And whenever I hear it, I go right for it.